In April 1964, a newborn vanished from a Chicago hospital. No struggle, no witnesses, no trace. The FBI launched a nationwide search. 2 years later, they found a toddler abandoned in New Jersey and told Dora and Chester Fronczak, "This is your missing son." Dora and Chester Fronczak brought him home and raised him as Paul for the next 47 years. But in 2012, a DNA test revealed the unthinkable. The man they called Paul wasn't their biological child. He wasn't Paul Fronczak at all. So if this boy wasn't their missing son, who was he? And after nearly 50 years, where was the real Paul? The answers would lead to abandoned twins, a hidden identity, and one of the most complex missing persons cases in American history. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe for more mysterious true crime cases. Chicago in the spring of 1964 was a city on the cusp of change. The Beatles had just arrived in America, the World's Fair was drawing millions to New York, and in the maternity ward of Michael Reese Hospital on the city's south side, Dora and Chester Fronczak were about to become parents for the first time. Dora Fronczak was 28 years old, a warm and loving woman who had spent months preparing for this moment. She and her husband Chester, a machinist and Korean War veteran, had been married for several years and desperately wanted to start a family. When Dora went into labor on April 25, 1964, Chester rushed her to Michael Reese Hospital, one of Chicago's most respected medical facilities. The delivery went smoothly. At 7:43 in the morning on April 26th, Dora gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Paul Joseph Fronczak. He weighed 7 pounds, 7 ounces, and had a full head of dark hair. Dora cradled her newborn son, overwhelmed with joy and relief. Everything was perfect. In 1964, hospital security was nothing like it is today. There were no ID bracelets with matching barcodes, no electronic monitoring systems, no locked maternity wards. New mothers stayed in the hospital for several days after giving birth, and babies were kept in a communal nursery when they weren't with their mothers for feeding. Visitors could walk freely through the halls. Nurses came and went. It was an era of trust, when people didn't imagine that someone would walk into a hospital and take a child. The next morning, April 27th, Dora was resting in her hospital room. It was just after 9 in the morning. She had fed baby Paul about an hour earlier, and a nurse had taken him back to the nursery so Dora could get some rest. Chester had gone home to get some sleep himself after spending the night at the hospital. Then a woman appeared in Dora's doorway. She was dressed in a white nurse's uniform, complete with a cap. She looked professional, competent, like she belonged there. She smiled at Dora and explained that the pediatrician wanted to examine baby Paul. This wasn't unusual. Newborns were examined multiple times during their hospital stay. Dora, exhausted from labor and grateful for the attentive care, didn't question it. She watched as the woman in white walked down the hallway, presumably toward the nursery. The woman did go to the nursery. She walked in confidently, like she had every right to be there. She picked up baby Paul Fronczak from his bassinet, and then she walked out of Michael Reese Hospital with him. She simply walked out. No one stopped her. No one questioned her. A woman in a nurse's uniform carrying a baby wasn't suspicious in a maternity ward. She disappeared into the busy Chicago streets with a 1-day-old infant, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, she was long gone. It was nearly an hour before Dora started to worry. The examination was taking too long. She pressed the call button for the nurse. When a real nurse arrived, Dora asked when the baby would be brought back. The nurse looked confused. What examination? The pediatrician hadn't ordered any examination that morning. Dora's heart began to race. She described the woman who had come to her room, the nurse in white who had said she was taking Paul to be examined. The nurse's face went pale. She hurried to the nursery. Baby Paul wasn't there. The hospital erupted into chaos. Within minutes, security was searching every floor, every room, every closet. Chester received a phone call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His son was missing, not sick, not moved to another ward. Missing. He raced back to the hospital, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing. Dora was hysterical, screaming that someone had taken her baby, demanding that they find him. The Chicago Police Department arrived in force. They sealed off the hospital and began interviewing every staff member, every patient, every visitor who had been there that morning. They reviewed the sign-in logs, though many visitors didn't bother to sign in at all. They collected descriptions of the woman in the nurse's uniform. She was white, probably in her mid-30s, with light brown hair. She was average height, average build. She wore glasses. She looked like 1,000 other women in Chicago. Several nurses and visitors remembered seeing her in the hallways that morning, but no one had thought twice about her. Why would they? She looked exactly like she belonged there. The police put out an all-points bulletin. The FBI was called in. This was a federal offense now, a case that required their attention. Every hospital, every bus station, every train terminal in the region was put on alert. Roadblocks were set up. The story hit the newspapers that afternoon, and by evening it was national news. A baby had vanished from a Chicago hospital in broad daylight. The Fronczak's nightmare had just begun. Dora couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop crying. She had held her son for less than 24 hours before he was taken away from her. Chester tried to stay strong for his wife, but inside he was falling apart. The police assured them they were doing everything possible, but as the hours turned into days with no leads, hope began to fade. The FBI interviewed hundreds of people. They investigated every woman in the Chicago area who had recently lost a baby or had a history of mental illness related to pregnancy. They followed up on tips from across the country. People called in claiming they'd seen a woman with a baby matching Paul's description. Each lead was investigated, each one led nowhere. The woman in the nurse's uniform had vanished as completely as baby Paul. 1 week passed, then 2, then a month. The media coverage continued, keeping the story in the public eye. Dora and Chester appeared on television, begging for their son's return. They offered a reward. They pleaded with whoever took him to leave Paul somewhere safe where he would be found. They just wanted their baby back. But Paul Fronczak remained missing. The investigation revealed security failures at Michael Reese Hospital that seemed almost incomprehensible by today's standards. There had been no system to verify that the woman in the nurse's uniform actually worked there. Hospital staff uniforms could be purchased at medical supply stores. Anyone could walk into the maternity ward. The nursery had no locked doors, no security cameras, no alarm systems. It was a tragedy waiting to happen, and the Fronczaks had paid the price. As the months dragged on, the case began to go cold. The FBI continued to investigate, but without new leads, there was little they could do. The person responsible had left no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no clues to her identity. It was as if she had been a ghost, appearing just long enough to destroy the Fronczaks' lives before disappearing back into the shadows. Dora fell into a deep depression. The nursery she had so carefully prepared sat empty, a constant reminder of the son she had lost. Chester threw himself into his work, unable to cope with the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. Their marriage was strained to the breaking point. How do you move forward when your child has been taken and might still be out there somewhere? But they couldn't give up. They couldn't accept that Paul was gone forever. And then, nearly 2 years after that terrible morning in April 1964, they got a phone call that would change everything. On July 2, 1965, a couple in Newark, New Jersey was walking through a rundown neighborhood when they heard a child crying. They followed the sound to a small variety store and discovered a toddler, abandoned and alone. The little boy was dirty, wearing clothes that were too small for him. He appeared to be about 2 years old. He was frightened and unable to tell them who he was or where he came from. The couple called the police. The Newark Police Department took the boy into protective custody. He was examined by a doctor who estimated his age at approximately 18 to 24 months. He was malnourished and showed signs of neglect, but otherwise appeared healthy. The authorities tried to determine his identity, checking missing children reports from the area. No one came forward to claim him. Then someone made a connection. One of the officers remembered the Paul Fronczak case from Chicago. It had been national news after all. The timing was right. Paul had vanished as a newborn in April 1964. This abandoned boy was approximately the right age. Could it be possible? The FBI was notified. They contacted Dora and Chester Fronczak with the news that a toddler had been found in New Jersey who might be their missing son. After 15 months of agony, of hoping and praying and trying not to give up, the Fronczaks were told that Paul might have been found. Dora and Chester rushed to New Jersey. When they were brought to see the little boy, their hearts nearly stopped. He had dark hair like Paul had as a newborn. He was the right age. But could they really identify a child they had only known for one day, a child they hadn't seen in over a year? Babies change so much in their first years of life. The FBI conducted what tests they could. This was 1965, long before DNA testing existed. The best they could do was compare blood types and look for physical similarities. The boy's blood type was compatible with the Fronczaks. He had no unusual identifying marks, no birthmarks that could definitively prove or disprove his identity. The Fronczaks looked at the toddler's face, trying to see their missing son in his features. They wanted so desperately for it to be Paul. The FBI told them that based on the available evidence, they believed this was their son. The age was right. The circumstances were suspicious. A child doesn't just get abandoned in Newark by coincidence after vanishing from Chicago. The person responsible might have panicked, realizing she couldn't keep a baby forever. Maybe she had abandoned him, hoping he would be found and cared for. Dora picked up the little boy. He looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. She felt a connection, a pull. She wanted to believe this was her Paul, the baby who had been taken from her arms. Chester stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, wanting to believe it too. They made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. They took the boy home to Chicago as their son, Paul Fronczak. The reunion made headlines across the country. The missing baby had been found after 15 months. The heartbroken parents finally had their son back. It was a happy ending to a tragic story. Photographs of Dora and Chester with the toddler appeared in newspapers everywhere. The country celebrated with them. But privately, Dora had doubts. She never spoke about them publicly, not for many years. But deep down, in a place she barely acknowledged even to herself, she wasn't completely certain this was her baby. The boy didn't look quite like she remembered. He didn't feel quite right in her arms. But how could she say that? How could she reject a child that the FBI said was her son? How could she put him back into the system when he had already been through so much? And what if she was wrong? What if this really was Paul and she was doubting her own son? So she pushed the doubts down and tried to love the boy as her own. The child they called Paul Fronczak grew up in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Chester continued to work as a machinist, and Dora devoted herself to raising Paul and later his younger brother Dave, who was born a few years after Paul came home. To the outside world, they were a normal, happy family. The abduction became a part of their family history, a terrible ordeal they had survived. But the doubts never completely went away. Paul himself had a relatively normal childhood, at least on the surface. He went to school, played with friends, got into the typical childhood trouble. But as he grew older, he began to notice things that didn't quite add up. He didn't look much like his parents. Chester was tall and blonde. Dora was short with light brown hair. Paul had dark hair and darker features. Of course, genetics can be unpredictable, but the differences were noticeable. There were other things too. Paul had medical issues that didn't seem to run in the family. His ears were shaped differently than his parents' ears. Small things easily explained away, but they nagged at him. When Paul was 10 years old, he found a box of newspaper clippings in the basement. The headlines shocked him. Baby missing from hospital. Lost infant found. He confronted his parents, demanding to know what the articles meant. That was when Dora and Chester sat him down and told him the story. He had vanished as a baby and then been found in New Jersey. It was a dramatic story, and Paul tried to process what it meant for his identity. His parents assured him that he was their son, that the FBI had confirmed it, that there was no doubt. Paul wanted to believe them. But the discovery planted a seed of uncertainty that would grow over the years. As Paul entered his teenage years, the doubts intensified. He felt disconnected from his family in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He loved his parents, but he didn't feel like he truly belonged. Was this normal teenage angst, or was it something deeper? He couldn't tell. He tried to push the thoughts away and focus on living his life. Paul graduated from high school, went to college, and eventually got married. He started a career and began building his own family. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but the questions never left him. Who was he really? Was he truly Paul Fronczak, or was he someone else entirely? The turning point came in the early 2000s. By then, DNA testing had become widely available and remarkably accurate. Paul had heard stories about people using DNA tests to confirm family relationships, to find long-lost relatives, to solve mysteries about their heritage. The technology that hadn't existed when he was found in New Jersey could now answer the question that had haunted him for decades. Was he really Paul Fronczak? Paul approached his parents about taking a DNA test. Dora's reaction told him everything he needed to know. She didn't seem surprised by the request. In fact, she seemed almost relieved. After 40-some years of silence, she finally admitted her doubts. She told Paul what she had never told anyone else. She had never been completely certain he was her biological son. The FBI had told her he was, and she had wanted so desperately to believe it. But deep down, she had always wondered. Chester's reaction was different. He was angry, defensive. As far as he was concerned, Paul was his son, end of story. He had raised him, loved him, and that was what mattered. He didn't want to take a DNA test. He didn't want to open old wounds, but Dora and Paul both knew they needed answers. In 2012, when Paul was 49 years old, he finally took a DNA test. The results came back a few weeks later. Paul sat in his living room, staring at the paper in his hands, reading the words over and over, unable to fully process what they meant. The test was definitive. There was zero probability that Dora and Chester Fronczak were his biological parents. He wasn't related to them at all. He wasn't Paul Fronczak. Everything he had believed about his identity was a lie. The name on his birth certificate wasn't his real name. The parents who raised him weren't his biological parents. The family history he thought was his own belonged to someone else entirely. But if he wasn't Paul Fronczak, then who was he? And where was the real Paul? The DNA results sent shockwaves through Paul's world. At 49 years old, he had to confront the reality that his entire identity was built on a mistake, or possibly even a lie. The man he had been for nearly 5 decades didn't actually exist. He wasn't Paul Joseph Fronczak, the baby taken from Michael Reese Hospital in 1964. He was someone else, someone with a different name, a different family, a different history. But who? The revelation was devastating for everyone involved. Dora, who had spent 47 years loving and raising this child as her son, now had to face the truth that he wasn't her biological baby. The real Paul was still out there somewhere, or possibly not alive at all. Chester struggled to accept the results. To him, Paul would always be his son, regardless of genetics. The years they had spent together couldn't be erased by a DNA test. For the man who had been called Paul Fronczak his entire life, the discovery triggered an identity crisis unlike anything most people can imagine. Every document with his name on it was technically a lie. His birth certificate, his social security card, his driver's license, all listed a name that wasn't truly his. Legally, he was still Paul Fronczak, but biologically, genetically, he was a complete stranger to himself. He had to know the truth. Paul made the decision to find out who he really was, and in doing so, perhaps discover what had happened to the real Paul Fronczak. It was a search that would consume the next several years of his life and take him down paths he never could have imagined. The first step was understanding what had happened in Newark in 1965. Paul began researching the circumstances of how he had been found. He obtained police reports and newspaper articles from that time. The official story was that he had been discovered abandoned in a store, crying and alone. But the details were sketchy. Who had left him there? Why? Had someone deliberately left a child there, hoping to avoid consequences? Or was there another explanation entirely? Paul hired a private investigator and a genetic genealogist to help with the search. With modern DNA technology and genealogy databases, it was now possible to identify people based on their genetic relatives. Paul submitted his DNA to several ancestry websites, hoping to find matches with distant cousins or other relatives who might provide clues to his real identity. The first breakthrough came relatively quickly. Paul's DNA matched with several individuals who shared a common ancestor. By analyzing these matches and building out family trees, the genetic genealogist began to narrow down possibilities. Paul's ancestry appeared to be largely Eastern European, with roots in areas that are now part of Poland and surrounding regions. This didn't match the Fronczak's background at all, confirming what the DNA test had already proven. As the investigation progressed, a name began to emerge: Rosenthal. Multiple branches of Paul's DNA matches connected to families with the surname Rosenthal. The genealogist worked backward through historical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and census data. A pattern emerged pointing to a specific family that had lived in New Jersey and Pennsylvania in the mid-20th century. Then came the revelation that would make everything even more complicated. The genetic evidence suggested that Paul was likely connected to a family that had reported twin children missing in 1965. Not just one child, but two, a boy and a girl, fraternal twins, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances around the same time the toddler was found abandoned in Newark. The twins' names were Jack and Jill Rosenthal. Paul's investigation led him to discover that in the summer of 1965, these twin toddlers had vanished from a home in New Jersey under circumstances that were never fully explained. The mother, a young woman in her early 20s, had reported them missing, but the details were murky. There were suggestions of neglect, possibly troubling situations. The case hadn't received the same media attention as the Fronczak situation, perhaps because it involved a troubled family rather than a hospital incident. Could Paul be Jack Rosenthal? And if so, where was his twin sister Jill? The implications were staggering. If Paul was really Jack Rosenthal, then he had a twin sister out there somewhere, who might also have been abandoned or given away. The genetic genealogist continued to build out the family tree, trying to locate living relatives who might be able to confirm the connection and provide more information. Paul managed to track down members of the Rosenthal family. The meetings were emotional and complicated. Some relatives were shocked to learn about the twins' disappearance. Others seemed to have vague memories of family drama and children who had gone missing decades earlier. The family had fractures and secrets, and not everyone wanted to talk about the past. Through these connections, Paul learned about his possible biological mother. Her name was Marie, though accounts varied about her exact identity and background. She had been young, possibly unstable, and had apparently been involved in a relationship that produced the twins. What had happened to those children had been a source of shame and secrecy within the family for 50 years. Paul obtained DNA samples from relatives who were willing to help. The results confirmed what the genealogy research had suggested. He was indeed related to the Rosenthal family. The probability that he was Jack Rosenthal was extremely high. After nearly 5 decades, he finally had a name that was truly his own. But the revelation brought as many questions as answers. What had happened to his twin sister Jill? Why had he been abandoned in Newark? Was it his biological mother who had left him in that store, or had someone else been involved? And why hadn't the authorities connected his abandonment to the missing Rosenthal twins at the time? Paul launched a desperate search for his sister. If he had survived being abandoned, perhaps she had too. Maybe she had been found by a different family, adopted under a different name, living somewhere with no idea she had a twin brother. The genetic genealogist helped Paul search DNA databases for a female relative who would be the right age and have the right genetic markers to be his twin. Months passed with no clear leads. Paul appeared on television shows and in news interviews, telling his story and pleading for information about his twin sister. The story of the missing baby who turned out to be someone else entirely captivated the public. People from across the country reached out with tips, theories, and possible leads. Then, in 2015, came the discovery that would close one chapter of Paul's search while leaving another open forever. Through the DNA databases and investigative work, Paul and his team identified a woman they believed with high certainty was Jill Rosenthal. The genetic markers were a match. This was his twin sister. After 50 years, he had found her. But he was too late. Jill had passed away in 2013, just 2 years earlier. She had lived her entire life under a different name, apparently never knowing she had been one of the missing Rosenthal twins. She had been raised by another family, the circumstances of her adoption or placement unclear. She had lived, struggled with her own challenges, and was gone without ever meeting the brother who spent years searching for her. Paul was devastated. To come so close to finally know who his sister was, only to learn he had missed meeting her by just 2 years, was almost unbearable. He had questions only she could have answered. What did she remember? Had she ever felt like something was missing from her life? Did she look like him? He would never know. Paul did manage to connect with some of Jill's family members and learned what he could about the sister he never got to meet. He saw photographs of her. The resemblance was undeniable. She had the same dark eyes, the same facial structure. These were the features he had seen in the mirror his entire life, never knowing they connected him to a twin sister lost in the chaos of 1965. But even with this partial answer to his own identity, Paul couldn't let go of the other half of the mystery. He had discovered who he was, but the original question remained unanswered. Where was the real Paul Fronczak? While Jack, the man who had lived as Paul Fronczak, was searching for his own identity, he never lost sight of the original case. Somewhere out there, if he was still alive, was the real baby taken from Michael Reese Hospital in April 1964. That child would now be in his 50s, possibly with no idea about his true origins. Finding the real Paul became an obsession. Jack felt a responsibility, even a moral obligation, to solve the mystery that had defined Dora and Chester's lives. They had raised him with love, even if he wasn't their biological son. He owed it to them to find out what had happened to their real child. The investigation into the real Paul's whereabouts was even more challenging than finding his own identity. There were no DNA databases to search, no genetic breadcrumbs to follow. The person responsible had disappeared without a trace 50 years earlier. The child could have been raised anywhere, under any name. He might not even know he was adopted, let alone taken. Jack started by re-examining the original case. He obtained FBI files through Freedom of Information Act requests, reading through decades-old investigative reports. He studied the description of the woman who had posed as a nurse. He looked at every lead the FBI had followed, every theory they had considered. One detail that emerged was particularly disturbing. In the months after Paul's disappearance, there had been several reports of a woman trying to take babies from hospitals in the Midwest. She would dress as a nurse and attempt to remove infants from maternity wards. In some cases, she was stopped before she could leave the building. The descriptions matched the woman who had taken Paul Fronczak. This suggested that Paul's case wasn't an isolated incident. The woman who took him had done this before, or tried to. She had a compulsive need to obtain infants. But why? Was she unable to have children of her own? Had she lost a baby and been driven by grief? Or was there a darker explanation? Jack also learned about other cases of babies taken from hospitals around the same time period. In the 1960s, hospital security was lax across the country, and such incidents were more common than most people realized. Many of those missing babies were never found. The cases had prompted changes in hospital security nationwide, but for the families affected, those changes came too late. The more Jack investigated, the more he realized how difficult it would be to find the real Paul. If someone had raised him as their own child, he would have a completely different identity. His birth certificate would be fraudulent, showing someone else as his mother. He might have had a normal life, never suspecting the truth. Or the outcome could have been much darker. Jack had to consider the possibility that the real Paul Fronczak hadn't survived. Such incidents sometimes ended tragically. If the person responsible had taken Paul in a moment of mental illness and then realized what she had done, the situation could have turned deadly. The child might have passed away shortly after being taken, his remains hidden where they would never be found. It was a grim thought, but Jack couldn't ignore it. Despite the difficulties, Jack continued the search. He hired investigators to look into suspicious adoptions that had occurred in 1964 and 1965. He searched for men born around April 1964 who might have inconsistencies in their birth records or family histories. He appeared on television shows, hoping someone with information would come forward. Some leads seemed promising. A man in Michigan contacted Jack saying he had always suspected something was off about his birth certificate. His family had moved when he was young, and there were gaps in his early childhood that didn't make sense. Could he be the real Paul Fronczak? DNA testing said no. Another lead came from a woman whose brother had been adopted in the mid-60s. The family had always been secretive about where he came from. The timing seemed right, but again, DNA testing ruled out the connection. Each dead end was frustrating, but Jack refused to give up. He knew the real Paul was out there somewhere, assuming he had survived. Finding him was just a matter of asking the right questions and following the right leads. In 2019, after years of investigation, Jack announced that he believed he had finally identified the real Paul Fronczak. The man was living in Michigan, working as a tradesman, and had no idea about his true origins. Jack had been put in touch with him through a series of connections and genetic genealogy work. The potential match came about through DNA analysis of relatives connected to the Fronczak family. By building out the family tree and looking for genetic connections that had been previously unknown, researchers identified a man who appeared to be a close biological match to Dora and Chester's other son, Dave. If this man was Dave's biological brother, then he had to be the real Paul Fronczak. Jack reached out to the man, explaining the situation. It was a delicate conversation. How do you tell someone that they might have been taken as a baby, that their entire identity might be built on a lie? The man was understandably shocked and skeptical. He had lived his entire life with one identity, and now a stranger was telling him he was someone else. But he agreed to take a DNA test. The waiting period was agonizing. For Dora Fronczak, now in her 80s, this represented the possibility of finally knowing what had happened to her real son. For over 50 years, she had lived with the uncertainty, not knowing if her baby had survived or where he might be. Chester had passed away in 2017 without ever knowing the truth. When the results came back, they were conclusive. The man from Michigan was indeed the biological son of Dora and Chester Fronczak. He was the baby taken from Michael Reese Hospital in April 1964. After 55 years, the real Paul had been found. The man, who had been living under a completely different name, now had to process this information. He had been raised by a woman who, it turned out, was not his biological mother. The details of how he had ended up with her were murky and may never be fully known. Had she been responsible herself? Had she obtained him from someone else? Had she known he was a taken baby, or had she believed he was legitimately hers? The man chose not to publicly reveal his identity or speak to the media. He wanted privacy to process this life-changing information. He did agree to meet with Dora Fronczak. The reunion was emotional and complex. Dora was meeting her biological son for the first time since he was 1 day old. He was meeting a woman who was genetically his mother, but a complete stranger to him. They were connected by biology, but separated by a lifetime of lived experience. For Jack, finding the real Paul brought a sense of closure to one part of the mystery. He had fulfilled his mission to discover what had happened to the baby taken in 1964. But it also meant fully accepting that he had no connection to the Fronczak family beyond the years they had spent together. He was Jack Rosenthal, not Paul Fronczak. The question of what to call himself remained complicated. Legally, he was still Paul Fronczak. Changing his name at this point would require a mountain of paperwork and documentation. But knowing his true identity meant he could finally understand his own origins, his genetic heritage, his real family history. It was an ending of sorts, but not the kind you see in movies. There was no dramatic reunion where everyone embraced and lived happily ever after. Instead, there were complicated emotions, questions that would never be answered, and the reality that 50 years of secrets and lies couldn't be undone. Even with both mysteries partially solved, enormous questions remain. The Paul Fronczak case, or rather cases, since it involves multiple missing children and mistaken identities, leaves behind a trail of unanswered questions that haunt everyone involved. First and foremost, who was responsible? The woman who dressed as a nurse and walked into Michael Reese Hospital in 1964 has never been identified. No arrest was ever made. The FBI investigated the case intensely at the time, but came up empty. The woman disappeared into anonymity, and unless she confesses or someone who knew her comes forward, her identity will likely remain a mystery forever. Theories about her motivation vary. Some investigators believe she was a woman who had recently lost a baby and was mentally unstable, driven by grief to take someone else's child. The 1960s had fewer resources for mental health treatment, and a woman suffering from postpartum issues or depression might have acted impulsively, convinced that she needed a baby to replace the one she had lost. Others theorized she was part of an illegal adoption ring. In the 1960s, there was a thriving market for babies. Wealthy couples who couldn't adopt through legitimate channels would pay large sums for infants, no questions asked. The person responsible might have been taking babies to sell them. But if that was the case, why hadn't the real Paul Fronczak been sold? Why had he ended up with a family in Michigan instead? There's also the disturbing possibility that whoever did this simply wanted a baby and didn't care who she hurt to get one. Some criminals are opportunistic. She might have seen a chance to walk into a hospital and take an infant, and she did it without considering the consequences. Whoever she was, she destroyed multiple lives with her actions. The second major question: what exactly happened to Jack and Jill Rosenthal? We know that Jack ended up abandoned in Newark in 1965, where he was found and eventually misidentified as Paul Fronczak. We know that Jill was raised under a different identity and passed away in 2013. But how did they end up separated? Who left them? Why? The biological mother, whoever she was, had twin toddlers who vanished from her care. Was she the one who left them? Did she give them away? Were they taken from her? The family members Jack spoke with had conflicting or vague memories. Some suggested the mother had been young and unprepared for parenthood. Others hinted at darker circumstances, neglect, or troubling situations. It's possible that the twins were removed from their mother's care by someone who thought they were helping. Perhaps a family member or friend took the children away from a dangerous situation and then, unable to care for both twins, left them separately, hoping they would be found and placed in better homes. Or perhaps the mother herself, overwhelmed and desperate, made the decision to abandon her children. This was 1965, before modern social services and support systems existed. A young single mother with twins would have faced enormous social stigma and financial hardship. In her desperation, she might have believed leaving them was the only option. We'll probably never know the truth. The third question: how did the authorities miss the connection? When Jack was found abandoned in Newark in 1965, someone made the connection to the Fronczak case, which is why Dora and Chester were contacted. But no one connected the abandoned toddler to the missing Rosenthal twins. Why not? The twins had been reported missing around the same time. The age was right. Why didn't investigators consider that the boy found in Newark might be one of the missing twins? The answer probably lies in the limitations of 1960s investigative technology and record-keeping. Different police departments didn't have easy ways to share information across jurisdictions. The Rosenthal case might have been reported to local police but never made it into a national database. The Newark police were focused on finding the boy's parents, not on checking every missing child report in the country. If DNA testing had existed in 1965, none of this would have happened. Jack would have been identified as Jack Rosenthal immediately. The real Paul Fronczak's situation would have been exposed when someone tried to pass off another child as the missing baby. But that technology was decades away, and mistakes were made that couldn't be undone. Another haunting question: did the real Paul's adoptive family know? The woman who raised the real Paul Fronczak in Michigan, was she the person responsible herself? Or did she obtain the baby from someone else, possibly believing the adoption was legitimate? Did she know throughout his entire childhood that he was a taken baby, living with that secret? Or was she an innocent party who had been lied to? The man who is the real Paul has chosen not to speak publicly about his upbringing or his adoptive family. That's his right, and his privacy should be respected, but it means we may never know the full story of what happened after he was taken, and how he ended up in Michigan. There's also the question of emotional impact. How do you process learning that your entire identity was a lie? Both Jack and the real Paul had to confront this reality in their 50s, after living half a century with false identities. The psychological impact of such a revelation is profound and lasting. For Jack, he lost not only his identity, but also his sense of belonging. The family he had grown up with wasn't biologically his. The twin sister he never knew existed was gone. His biological mother was apparently someone troubled who had abandoned him. His entire origin story was one of abandonment and secrets. For the real Paul, the revelation was equally devastating. Learning you were taken as a baby, that your whole life was based on a crime, is traumatic. He had to reconcile his sense of self with this new information. He had to decide whether to form a relationship with his biological mother, a woman who was a stranger to him. And for Dora Fronczak, the woman at the center of this tragedy, the emotional toll was incalculable. She lost her son when he was 1 day old. She spent 47 years raising a child she was told was her son, loving him and caring for him, only to discover he wasn't hers biologically. Then, when she finally met her real son, he was a middle-aged man she had no shared history with. She got her son back, but she also lost 55 years she could never get back. Chester Fronczak passed away in 2017 without ever meeting his biological son. He went to his grave still insisting that Jack was his son, refusing to accept the DNA results. In his heart, the boy he raised was Paul, and nothing could change that. It's a testament to the power of love and family bonds that transcend biology, but also a tragedy that he never got to know his biological child. The case raises profound questions about identity and family. What makes someone your child? Is it biology, or is it the years spent raising them? Can you love and claim someone who isn't genetically yours? The answer clearly is yes. Dora and Chester loved Jack as their son for nearly 50 years. That love was real, even if the biological connection wasn't. But it also shows the importance of truth. Jack deserved to know who he really was. The real Paul deserved to know his origins. Dora deserved to know what had happened to her baby. The lies and mistakes, even well-intentioned ones, caused decades of pain and confusion. Today, hospital security has been revolutionized because of cases like this. Newborns wear electronic tags that trigger alarms if they're taken beyond the maternity ward. Mothers and babies have matching ID bracelets. Security cameras monitor every entrance and exit. Staff members wear photo IDs. The kind of casual theft that happened in 1964 would be nearly impossible now. But these changes came too late for the Fronczaks and the Rosenthals and countless other families whose children were taken before the security upgrades. DNA testing has also revolutionized the way we solve these kinds of mysteries. Genetic genealogy databases have helped identify victims, solve cold cases, and reunite families separated by decades. If Jack had taken a DNA test just a few years earlier, he might have found his sister while she was still alive. If the real Paul had submitted his DNA to an ancestry website, he might have discovered his origins before Jack found him. These technological advances give us hope that other missing children from that era might still be identified. There are databases now dedicated to helping people born in suspicious circumstances discover their true identities. Adoption agencies are more transparent. Records that were once sealed are being opened. But for the Franczak case, these advances came just a little too late to answer every question. The story of Paul Franczak is not a simple mystery with a neat resolution. It's a complex web of mistaken identities, abandoned children, and families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. It's a story about the lengths we'll go to discover who we really are and where we came from. Jack Rosenthal, the man who lived as Paul Franczak for 49 years, spent years of his life searching for answers. He found some of them, but many questions will haunt him forever. He knows his real name now. He knows he had a twin sister. He knows his biological family's history. But he'll never know what his life might have been if he hadn't been abandoned, if he had grown up as Jack Rosenthal with his sister Jill beside him. The real Paul Franczak knows his origins now, too. He knows he was taken from a hospital as a baby, that his biological parents spent decades searching for him. But he also has to live with the knowledge that his entire life was built on a crime. The family that raised him will forever be complicated by questions of what they knew and when they knew it. And Dora Franczak, now in her late 80s, finally has answers after more than 50 years of uncertainty. She knows what happened to her baby. She's met the son who was taken from her. But she can never get back those 55 years, can never undo the pain and grief she suffered. The resolution brings closure, but it doesn't erase the trauma. This case reminds us that identity is precious and fragile. We take for granted knowing who we are, where we came from, who our parents and siblings are. But for children who were taken, abandoned, or misidentified, that basic knowledge is something they have to fight for. It reminds us that crimes can echo across generations. The woman who took baby Paul in 1964 probably never imagined that her actions would still be affecting people 50 years later. She destroyed a family's peace, created a mistaken identity, and generated a mystery that would haunt everyone involved for half a century. And it reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything, Jack never gave up searching for the truth. The real Paul agreed to take a DNA test and confront the reality of his origins. Dora survived losing her son twice and found the strength to meet him again as a stranger. These are ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and found a way through. If there's a lesson in this story, it's that the truth matters. It may be painful, it may be complicated, but knowing who you are is a fundamental human right. Jack Rosenthal deserved to know his real name. The real Paul Franczak deserved to know where he came from. And somewhere out there may be other taken or abandoned children from that era who still don't know their true identities. Their stories deserve to be told too. If this case has affected you or made you think about identity, family, and what it means to truly know yourself, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. And if you know someone who was adopted or born under mysterious circumstances in the 1960s, share this story with them. You never know who might finally find the answers they've been searching for. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more true crime mysteries, and remember that behind every case are real people whose lives were forever changed by events beyond their control. Their stories matter, and they deserve to be heard.